I hear him. Down goes Frazier. Down goes Frazier.
Hey, what's up with it, fam? It's Hot Boxing Minute, your favorite pharmaceutical engineer turned boxing analyst, back at you with the realness. Just really quick, want to talk about last night's fight card out there in Texas. Vergil Ortiz Jr. gets the knockout stoppage win over a very game Mike McKinson. I think most of us knew going into it that Mike McKinson was going to be severely outmatched, and he was in this fight. He did manage to make it semi-competitive, but definitely was on the back foot with his back against the ropes. Now, he dropped him twice, or Vergil Ortiz Jr. dropped Mike McKinson twice, and it was kind of a weird stoppage because Mike McKinson essentially was the first person to take Vergil Ortiz past the 8th round. You know, Vergil Ortiz with his 16 straight knockouts. But he took him past the 8th round, but barely got into the 9th round. It looked like the body shot that dropped Mike McKinson in the 8th round was also responsible for what happened in the 9th round. It looked like Vergil Ortiz Jr. barely touched Mike McKinson, and then Mike McKinson fell, got back up, and then started hobbling around. His father and his trainer, who was in his corner, who is the same person, by the way, was smart enough and had the wherewithal to throw in the towel. Very intelligent move on the part of Mike McKinson and his dad, or his trainer. And I think that's kind of something that's very good, that he had the eyes and the wherewithal to just know that it was time. Didn't want to see Mike McKinson take any more unnecessary punishment. Vergil Ortiz Jr. looking very sharp after recovering from his rhabdomyolisis. Rhabdomyolysis. I believe that's how you pronounce it. Anyways, where your body overprocesses the proteins in your muscle and your bone and ends up dumping it into your bloodstream, causing all kind of circulatory issues, which can damage your internal organs. That was what happened to Vergil Ortiz Jr., but Vergil Ortiz Jr. looked like he's in pretty good shape, showed good form in his fight against Mike McKinson. I would say he wasn't as accurate as we're used to seeing him, but then again, Mike McKinson is a very adept, very defensive, very slick southpaw fighter from the UK. And regardless of how slick Mike McKinson was, Vergil Ortiz Jr. still got the knockout. Now, where does this latest victory place Vergil Ortiz Jr.? According to the boxing rankings, hold on, let me check and pull this up. Okay, so after this latest fight by Vergil Ortiz Jr., which resulted in a 9th round knockout victory win against Mike McKinson, Vergil Ortiz Jr. is now #1 ranked contender in the WBO and the WBA system. And pretty much in all the other sanctioning bodies, he's hovering around the top 1 through 3 positions. He's hovering right there with Jerron Boots Ennis and Conor Benn and Keith Thurman. You know, he's not going to get that Terrence Crawford versus Errol Spence fight because they're wrapped up in their negotiations. So let's see, how do I word this correctly? Okay. With Vergil Ortiz Jr. getting this recent knockout win over Mike McKinson, he's #1 ranked on the WBO and WBA sanctioning bodies. In the other sanctioning bodies, he's in the 1 through 3. He's hovering in the same position in the 1 through 3, right there with Boots Ennis, Keith Thurman, and Conor Benn. Now, we know he's not going to get the fight with Terrence Crawford or Errol Spence, most likely because they're going to fight each other next. So what is next for Vergil Ortiz Jr.? Does he fight Conor Benn? Does he fight Boots Ennis? Does he get that fight with Keith Thurman? You tell me. Your guess is as good as mine as far as what Vergil Ortiz Jr. is going to do next. He's obviously immensely talented. I felt like he lost a bit of accuracy in his performance, but regardless, he was still accurate enough to be a dangerous knockout threat to Mike McKinson the entire fight. Vergil Ortiz Jr., man, is an amazingly talented fighter. I hope nobody denies that at the very least. You have to give Vergil Ortiz Jr. his credit. He is a terrifying menace inside the ring. A really nice dude outside the ring, plays his guitars on his IG lives. Inside that ring, he's a menace. He hits you like he is mad that his last punch didn't knock you out. So he throws the next punch with extraordinary prejudice and anger, and he's trying to get you out of there. He does. Visually, it looks like he leaves himself open for counter shots, but nobody has been able to exploit the openings that Vergil Ortiz gives when he's loading up on those crazy knockout punches. So until somebody shows it to be a problem, it isn't a problem. But, you know, I think Vergil Ortiz Jr. versus Jerron Boots Ennis would be an awesome fight. I think it would be a lot more competitive than a lot of people give it credit for. I don't think it would be an easy fight for either party. And it would definitely benefit boxing as a whole if those two got in the ring with each other. But We all know how boxing is. Will we ever see a fight between Jaron Ennis and Vergil Ortiz Jr. before they hit their 30s? You tell me. Moving on to the other fight on that, we saw, goodness, why am I forgetting his name? The loudmouth guy that polarizes boxing audiences, Blair The Flair Cobbs, got arguably the biggest win of his career against Maurice Hooker. Now, this was just months after the biggest loss of his career. He just got knocked out by Alexis Rocha. Now, you got to give him credit for at least having the gumption to get in there with a former champion like Maurice Hooker and essentially dismantling Mighty Mo. He dropped Maurice Hooker 3 times and got a decision win, a clear unanimous decision win after 10 rounds. I don't really know what's next for Maurice Hooker. Maurice Hooker looked disinterested. He came in overweight. They had to renegotiate the contract. So Maurice Hooker came in to the weigh into that fight heavy, and they had to change the agreement to a 150-pound limit. And Maurice Hooker had to pay out $15,000 to Team Blair The Flair Cobbs for that weight transgression. And the fight still went through, and Maurice Hooker still kind of lost in a one-sided decision where he got pretty much beat on at will by Blair The Flair Cobbs. Is the question I have going forward on this one, with Blair The Flair Cobbs getting arguably his biggest win over Mighty Mo Hooker, a former champion himself who's given us some awesome fights, with that latest win over Mighty Mo Hooker, where does Blair The Flair Cobbs go from here? Is this his peak? Does he still have higher to attain in the welterweight division? You tell me. I like Blair The Flair Cobbs. A lot of people don't. I think his athleticism, his youth, his energy, and his willingness to engage, his power, and also his defensive vulnerabilities make Blair The Flair Cobbs a fun fighter to watch. People don't like his outspokenness, and I can't say anything to convince people otherwise about his outspokenness. For those of you that follow my content, you already know I love me some loud, outspoken fighters. Sometimes they rise to the highest heights like Muhammad Ali, or they become multiple division champions like Adrian Broner. Sometimes they crash and burn in flames like Rolly Romero in his latest fight against Tank. But even Rolly Romero, despite his first loss against Tank, still, in my opinion, is highly marketable and is still someone fans are going to want to see. In the same way with Blair The Flair Cobbs, right? I'll never knock guys like Blair The Flair Cobbs because I think when they get memed into internet fame, it's great because it brings other viewers into the sport. With that being said, like I said, Blair The Flair Cobbs got his biggest win against the former champion Maurice Hooker. Where does Blair The Flair Cobbs go from here? Is he ready for the likes of guys like Conor Benn, Keith Thurman, David Avanesian? Does he even deserve to have his name mentioned amongst those kind of contenders? You tell me. I like Blair The Flair Cobbs. I think he has a lot more he can offer the fans. He's very young, a little bit green in his approach, but he's getting trained out there in wild card under Freddie Roach, so you're going to have to give faith in Freddie Roach's approach to training because he has trained champions in the past. Anyways, I don't want to wax poetic too much about Blair The Flair Cobbs. Congratulations on his win. I look forward to seeing what Blair The Flair Cobbs and Vergil Ortiz Jr. come through with next. Anyways, folks, let me know what you thought about that fight card overall. In the comment section, hit like, press follow if you haven't already done so. Anyways, y'all, this is Hot Boxing Minute, the future of boxing analysis on TikTok. Peace.